On April 26, 1986, the world witnessed what was officially described as a tragic accident at a nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union. For decades, governments, historians, and documentaries have told us the same story. Human error during a safety test led to the worst nuclear disaster in history. But what if almost everything we've been told about Chernobyl was carefully constructed propaganda? What if the real story involves deliberately concealed design flaws, sacrificed lives, and lies that reached the highest levels of Soviet power? What if the disaster was not just predictable, but inevitable? The truth about Chernobyl is far more disturbing than the official narrative suggests. This is the story they never wanted you to know. Before we reveal the shocking truth behind Chernobyl, tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our investigations into history's darkest secrets. Let's begin. The Chernobyl disaster wasn't caused solely by human error during a safety test on that fateful night in April 1986. The seeds of catastrophe were planted years earlier in the very blueprint of the RBMK reactor itself, a design that Soviet engineers knew was dangerously flawed from the beginning. The RBMK, which stands for Reactor Bolshoi Mощности, or High Power Channel Reactor, was a Soviet-designed nuclear reactor used primarily for electricity generation and plutonium production. Unlike Western reactor designs that incorporated multiple safety features and containment structures, the RBMK was built with cost efficiency and weapons-grade material production as top priorities, not safety. One of the most critical and dangerous design flaws was a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, this means that as the reactor's cooling water began to boil and turn to steam, the nuclear reaction would actually speed up rather than slow down. In Western reactors, the opposite occurs. A negative void coefficient ensures that loss of coolant automatically reduces the reaction, providing an inherent safety mechanism. The RBMK's positive void coefficient meant that any loss of cooling could trigger a runaway chain reaction that would be nearly impossible to stop. Soviet nuclear scientists were well aware of this fundamental design flaw, but economic and political pressures pushed the reactor into widespread use across the Soviet Union anyway. Another deadly design feature was a control rod mechanism. The control rods in a nuclear reactor are meant to slow down or stop the nuclear reaction by absorbing neutrons. However, the RBMK control rods had graphite tips, and when they were inserted into the reactor core, they initially caused a brief spike in reactivity before beginning to absorb neutrons. This design quirk, combined with a positive void coefficient, created a perfect storm scenario where attempting to shut down the reactor could actually cause a power surge. On the night of the disaster, when operators frantically hit the emergency shutdown button known as ACE-5, the graphite-tipped control rods caused exactly this surge, leading directly to the explosion. The RBMK reactor also lacked a robust containment structure, unlike Western nuclear plants. Western reactors are typically housed within thick concrete and steel containment buildings designed to prevent the release of radioactive materials even in the event of a meltdown. The RBMK had only a partial containment structure that was never designed to handle a major accident. This meant that when the reactor exploded, there was virtually nothing to prevent massive amounts of radioactive material from being released directly into the atmosphere. The lack of containment was not an oversight. It was a deliberate cost-cutting measure by Soviet planners who prioritized rapid construction and plutonium production for nuclear weapons over public safety. Perhaps most damningly, Soviet authorities knew about these design flaws for years before the Chernobyl disaster. Internal documents that were classified for decades reveal that nuclear scientists had warned their superiors about the dangers of the RBMK design as early as the 1970s. These warnings were systematically ignored or suppressed because acknowledging the flaws would have meant admitting that the Soviet nuclear program was fundamentally unsafe, which was politically unacceptable during the Cold War. The Soviet government had invested enormous resources in building RBMK reactors across the country, and admitting the design was flawed would have been both economically catastrophic and politically embarrassing on the world stage. The RBMK design was also chosen partly because it could produce plutonium for nuclear weapons while generating electricity. This dual-use capability made it attractive to Soviet military planners, but also meant that safety considerations were secondary to strategic military objectives. The reactor could be refueled while operating, which was useful for plutonium production, but added another layer of complexity and danger to operations. Every design choice that prioritized military utility over safety made the RBMK more unstable and more prone to catastrophic failure. By the time reactor number 4 at Chernobyl exploded, there were already multiple RBMK reactors operating throughout the Soviet Union. The disaster exposed not just a failure of one reactor, but the systemic negligence of an entire nuclear program built on flawed principles and concealed dangers. The truth is that Chernobyl was not an isolated accident. It was the inevitable result of a reactor design that should never have been built, operated by a system that valued secrecy and propaganda over human life. The events leading directly to the Chernobyl explosion began with a safety test that was anything but safe. On the night of April 25 to 26, 1986, engineers at Chernobyl's reactor number 4 were conducting an experiment to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough electricity to power the emergency cooling systems during a brief power outage. This test was important because nuclear reactors require continuous cooling even after shutdown, and in the event of a total power loss, there would be a dangerous gap of about 60 seconds before backup diesel generators could come online. The test was meant to see if the spinning turbines, as they coasted to a halt, could bridge that gap and provide enough power to keep the coolant pumps running. However, the tests had been delayed for more than 9 hours due to unexpected electricity demand from the grid. This delay meant that a different, less experienced shift of operators would be conducting the test. The day shift operators who had originally prepared for the experiment had gone home, and the night shift crew, led by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, took over. Dyatlov was known for his demanding and often intimidating management style, and there are accounts suggesting he pressured his subordinate operators to proceed with the test despite growing concerns about the reactor's behavior. To conduct the test, the operators had to reduce the reactor's power output to a low level. According to the test plan, the reactor should have been stabilized at around 700-1000 megawatts thermal. However, due to a series of operator errors and miscommunications, the power dropped much further, plummeting to just 30 megawatts. At this extremely low power level, the reactor entered a dangerous and unstable condition. The buildup of xenon-135, a neutron-absorbing byproduct of nuclear fission, began to poison the reaction and made it extremely difficult to raise the power back up. In a desperate attempt to increase the reactor's power and proceed with the test, the operators began withdrawing control rods far beyond what was considered safe. Operating procedures required that a minimum number of control rods remain inserted in the reactor core at all times to ensure operators could quickly shut down the reaction if needed. But to compensate for the xenon poisoning and raise the power level, the crew pulled out nearly all the control rods, leaving the reactor in a critically unstable state. At this point, the reactor was essentially a ticking time bomb, balanced on a knife's edge where any small disturbance could trigger a catastrophic power surge. Despite the mounting danger signals, Dyatlov ordered the test to proceed. The operators shut off several critical safety systems, including the emergency core cooling system, because these systems would have interfered with the test parameters. This decision violated multiple safety protocols and left the reactor without its last lines of defense. With the safety systems disabled, nearly all control rods withdrawn, and the reactor operating in an unstable low-power regime, the stage was set for disaster. The operators were essentially flying blind, unaware that the reactor's design flaws would turn their attempts to control it into the trigger for an explosion. At 1:23:40 a.m. on April 26, 1986, the operators pressed the AZ5 button to initiate an emergency shutdown. Under normal circumstances, this button would insert all control rods into the reactor core simultaneously, halting the nuclear reaction. But because of the RBMK's flawed design, specifically the graphite tips on the control rods, the insertion actually caused a brief but catastrophic spike in reactivity. The power output surged to more than 100 times the reactor's normal operating capacity in just a few seconds. The fuel rod shattered. The cooling water flashed instantly to steam, and the resulting pressure blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off its housing like a bottle cap. The explosion that followed was actually two explosions. The first was a steam explosion caused by the rapid vaporization of cooling water. The second, occurring just moments later, was likely a hydrogen explosion as superheated steam reacted with the reactor's zirconium fuel cladding. These explosions destroyed the reactor building, ejected burning graphite and nuclear fuel into the atmosphere, and exposed the reactor core directly to the open sky. The lies and deceptions about what happened that night would begin almost immediately, as Soviet authorities scrambled to control the narrative and hide the full extent of their negligence and the reactor's design flaws. Within minutes of the explosion, Soviet authorities began a campaign of deception and cover-up that would last for years. As flames and radioactive smoke billowed from the destroyed reactor, plant management refused to believe that the reactor core had been destroyed. Anatoly Dyatlov, despite being exposed to lethal doses of radiation and suffering from radiation sickness, insisted that the reactor was intact and that only a hydrogen tank or some other peripheral component had exploded. This denial was not simply shock or confusion. It was rooted in the Soviet system's inability to acknowledge catastrophic failure, especially in a prestige project like nuclear power. The plant director, Viktor Brukhanov, was immediately faced with a terrible choice. He could tell Moscow that the reactor had exploded and released massive amounts of radiation, which would bring down the full weight of Soviet bureaucratic punishment on him personally, or he could downplay the severity and hope to contain the situation locally. Brukhanov chose the latter, sending initial reports to Moscow that described a minor accident, with the reactor intact and radiation levels only slightly elevated. These false reports delayed the evacuation of nearby residents and prevented appropriate emergency response measures from being implemented in the critical first hours after the disaster. As the night progressed and radiation monitors in the plant began to max out or fail entirely due to off-scale readings, it became impossible to hide that something catastrophic had occurred. Firefighters arrived at the scene and were sent onto the roof of the destroyed reactor building to extinguish fires without being told they were being exposed to lethal radiation doses. Many of these firefighters received radiation doses of 5,000 to 20,000 Roentgens, doses that would kill them within days or weeks. They were heroes fighting an invisible enemy they didn't even know existed, sacrificed because telling them the truth would have required admitting the scale of the disaster. The Soviet government official response was coordinated from Moscow by a special commission hastily assembled and flown to the site. This commission included top nuclear scientists, Communist Party officials, and military commanders. Their primary goal was not to minimize casualties or environmental damage, but to control information and prevent panic that could destabilize the Soviet system. For more than 36 hours after the explosion, the residents of Pripyat, the city built to house Chernobyl workers and located just 3 kilometers from the plant, were not evacuated. Children played outside. People went about their normal routines, and all the while they were being irradiated by the radioactive cloud drifting over their city. The first public acknowledgement of the disaster came not from the Soviet Union, but from Sweden. On April 28, 1986, radiation alarms went off at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, more than 1,000 kilometers from Chernobyl. Swedish scientists detected radioactive particles in the air and on workers' clothing, and initially feared there had been a leak at their own facility. After determining their plant was not the source, they traced the radioactive cloud back to the Soviet Union. Only when confronted with this international detection did Soviet authorities issue a brief statement acknowledging that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl, though they still downplayed its severity. Even as the Soviet media began to report on the disaster, the information provided to the public was heavily censored and manipulated. State television broadcasts showed calm scenes of cleanup operations and reassured citizens that everything was under control. The true radiation levels, the number of people exposed, and the extent of environmental contamination were all treated as state secrets. Doctors treating radiation victims were forbidden from listing radiation as the cause of illness or death on medical records. Instead, they were instructed to attribute deaths to pneumonia, heart failure, or other secondary conditions caused by radiation, but not explicitly naming it. Internationally, the Soviet Union engaged in a disinformation campaign to deflect blame and minimize the perceived scale of the disaster. Soviet officials suggested that Western reports were exaggerated and motivated by anti-Soviet propaganda. They delayed sharing critical information about the release of radioactive isotopes, which would have helped other countries protect their populations from contaminated food and water. This obstruction of information cost lives and health outcomes far beyond Soviet borders, as European countries were left to make decisions about food safety and public health measures with incomplete and unreliable data. The cover-up at Chernobyl was not just a local Soviet problem. It was a global deception that put millions of people at unnecessary risk. In the days, weeks, and months following the Chernobyl explosion, the Soviet Union mobilized a massive workforce of emergency responders, soldiers, engineers, miners, and civilians to contain the disaster. These individuals became known as liquidators, a chilling term that reflects their mission: to liquidate the consequences of the catastrophe. Between 1986 and 1990, an estimated 600,000 to 800,000 people served as liquidators at Chernobyl, though some estimates place the number even higher. These men and women were thrust into the most radioactive environment on Earth, often with inadequate protection, incomplete information about the dangers they faced, and no real choice but to obey orders from Soviet authorities. The first liquidators were the firefighters who responded to the initial explosion. They arrived at the scene believing they were fighting an ordinary fire, not knowing they were stepping into a radioactive inferno. These firefighters climbed onto the roof of the destroyed reactor building and adjacent structures to extinguish fires burning in the graphite core and ejected nuclear fuel. They worked with standard firefighting equipment. No radiation suits, no dosimeters to measure their exposure, because no one had told them the truth. Many of these men absorbed radiation doses of 5,000 to 20,000 Roentgens within hours, suffering acute radiation syndrome that would kill them within days or weeks. As the scale of the disaster became clear, the Soviet military was called in to organize the cleanup operation. Soldiers, reservists, and conscripts were ordered to Chernobyl and given tasks that ranged from building containment structures to clearing radioactive debris from plant grounds. One of the most harrowing tasks fell to the biorobots. Soldiers sent on the roof of the reactor building to shovel highly radioactive graphite and fuel fragments back into the destroyed core. Soviet authorities initially tried to use actual robots for this task, but the intense radiation fried their electronics within minutes. Human beings became the replacement robots, sent to work in 90-second shifts because that was as long as they could safely be exposed to the radiation levels on the roof. These biorobots wore lead aprons and crude protective gear that did little to shield them from gamma radiation. They climbed onto the roof, shoveled debris for their allotted 90 seconds, then retreated, often having absorbed their lifetime maximum radiation dose in that brief period. Some witnesses report that soldiers who hesitated or refused were threatened with court-martial or worse. The official records claim that each biorobot was only sent up once, but numerous testimonies suggest that many were forced to go multiple times when there were not enough replacement workers. The courage of these men is undeniable, but they were also victims, sacrificed by a system that valued containing the political fallout of Chernobyl more than protecting human life. Miners from across the Soviet Union were brought to Chernobyl to dig a tunnel beneath the destroyed reactor. The plan was to build a cooling platform under the reactor to prevent the molten nuclear fuel from burning to the concrete foundation and contaminating the groundwater below. More than 10,000 miners, many of them from coal regions in Ukraine and Russia, worked around the clock in sweltering heat to complete this tunnel. They dug in shifts, often working in temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, while being exposed to significant radiation. Many of the miners worked shirtless or in minimal clothing due to the extreme heat, increasing their radiation exposure. This massive effort likely prevented an even greater catastrophe, but it came at a terrible cost to the health of the miners involved. The liquidators also included helicopter pilots who flew directly over the exposed reactor core to drop sand, lead, boron, and other materials in an attempt to smother the nuclear fire. These pilots flew dozens of sorties, each time passing through the radioactive plume rising from the reactor. The radiation levels were so intense that several helicopters experienced mechanical failures mid-flight, and at least one helicopter crashed into the reactor building, killing its crew. The heroism of these pilots cannot be overstated, but like so many liquidators, they were not fully informed of the risks they were taking or given adequate protection. Decades after the disaster, the fate of the liquidators remains a source of controversy. Official Soviet and later Russian government Records claim that only 31 people died as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster, mostly firefighters and plant workers who died of acute radiation syndrome in the immediate aftermath. However, these figures exclude the thousands of liquidators who have since died from cancers, cardiovascular diseases, and other conditions linked to radiation exposure. Estimating the true death toll is complicated by poor record-keeping, Soviet-era secrecy, and the difficulty of proving causation for radiation-induced illnesses that take years or decades to manifest. Some studies suggest that tens of thousands of liquidators have died prematurely due to their exposure to Chernobyl, though exact numbers remain fiercely debated. One of the most enduring controversies surrounding Chernobyl is the true death toll of the disaster. The official number provided by Soviet and later international authorities is 31 direct deaths, primarily among emergency responders and plant workers who died from acute radiation syndrome in the days and weeks following the explosion. However, this figure is widely regarded by independent scientists, physicians, and researchers as a gross underestimate that serves political and institutional interests rather than reflecting the true human cost of the catastrophe. The official death toll counts only those who died immediately or within a few months of the explosion from direct, high-dose radiation exposure. It excludes a far larger number of people who died later from radiation-induced cancers, cardiovascular diseases, and other health conditions caused by exposure to lower but still dangerous levels of radiation. This narrow definition of Chernobyl-related deaths has been criticized as a deliberate attempt to minimize the disaster's impact and protect the nuclear industry's reputation. International organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and the World Health Organization, WHO, have been accused of complicity in this undercount, issuing reports that rely on the restrictive Soviet-era definitions. Independent researchers and organizations have produced very different estimates of Chernobyl's death toll. A 2006 report commissioned by Greenpeace estimated that up to 93,000 people may have died or will die prematurely due to radiation exposure from Chernobyl. This estimate includes cancer deaths among the wider population exposed to radioactive fallout across Europe, not just those in the immediate vicinity of the plant. Other studies have produced estimates ranging from 4,000 additional cancer deaths, a figure endorsed by some UN agencies, to over 200,000 deaths when including broader populations and longer time frames. The difficulty in calculating an accurate death toll stems from several factors. First, radiation-induced cancers often take 10 to 30 years to develop, making it challenging to establish direct causation. Second, the Soviet government's initial cover-up meant that many people were exposed to radiation without their knowledge and were never properly monitored or included in health registries. Third, political and economic pressures have influenced how deaths are classified. Acknowledging tens of thousands of radiation deaths would create enormous financial liability for compensation claims and undermine confidence in nuclear power globally. The liquidators, the 600,000 to 800,000 emergency workers who participated in the cleanup, represent a particularly tragic subset of Chernobyl's victims. While the official narrative claims that most liquidators received acceptable radiation doses and suffered no serious health consequences, numerous studies of liquidator populations tell a different story. Research has found significantly elevated rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, and cardiovascular disease among liquidators compared to general populations. Many liquidators have reported chronic health problems, disability, and premature aging. Patient advocacy groups and independent physicians estimate that tens of thousands of liquidators have died prematurely, though exact numbers are difficult to determine due to poor record-keeping and dispersal of liquidator populations across the former Soviet Union. Children exposed to radioactive iodine, 131 in the aftermath of the disaster, have experienced epidemic levels of thyroid cancer. In Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia, thyroid cancer rates among those who were children in 1986 are tens or even hundreds of times higher than normal background rates. Thousands of cases of thyroid cancer have been directly attributed to Chernobyl, and while thyroid cancer is often treatable, it has still resulted in numerous deaths and lifelong health complications for survivors. The spike in thyroid cancer is one of the few health consequences of Chernobyl that is universally acknowledged because the timing and geographic distribution of cases makes the link to disaster irrefutable. The true death toll of Chernobyl will likely never be known with certainty. What is clear is that the official figure of 31 deaths is a politically motivated fiction that ignores the overwhelming scientific evidence of widespread radiation-induced illness and premature death. Whether the real number is 4,000, 93,000, or somewhere between, the human cost at Chernobyl is vastly greater than governments and nuclear industry advocates have ever been willing to admit. The numbers they hide tell a story of negligence, deception, and a callous disregard for human life that defined the Soviet system and continues to influence how nuclear disasters are reported and remembered today. If you're finding these shocking revelations about Chernobyl as disturbing as we are, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're only halfway through the true story, and what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew. Let's continue. Before April 26, 1986, Pripyat was a model Soviet city, a showcase of communist modernity built specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families. Founded in 1970, Pripyat grew rapidly into a thriving urban center with a population of nearly 50,000 people by 1986. It was considered a prestigious place to live, offering amenities and living standards that were exceptional by Soviet standards of the time. The city boasted modern apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, a cultural center, an amusement park set to open on May 1st, and even a sports complex and swimming pool. For the young, educated workers at the nuclear plant, Pripyat represented the promise of Soviet progress and prosperity. On the morning of April 26, 1986, as radiation from the destroyed reactor drifted over Pripyat, the city's residents had no idea of the danger they faced. Despite the explosion occurring in the middle of the night and being visible from the city, authorities did not immediately inform residents or advise them to take precautions. People woke up, sent their children to school, and went to work as usual. Some residents even gathered on a railway bridge, later grimly nicknamed the Bridge of Death, to watch the eerie blue glow and smoke rising from the power plant, unknowingly exposing themselves to lethal doses of radiation. Children played in parks where radioactive particles fell like invisible snow. The Soviet culture of secrecy and the local authorities' fear of causing panic led to a catastrophic delay in protecting the population. It wasn't until the afternoon of April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, that the evacuation of Pripyat finally began. Authorities announced that residents should prepare for a temporary evacuation of 3 days, bringing only essential documents, some food, and minimal clothing. They were told they would return soon, and that the evacuation was merely a precautionary measure. In reality, Soviet officials already knew that Pripyat would never be inhabitable again, but they feared that telling people the truth would cause panic and chaos. The lie about a temporary evacuation served to keep the population compliant and orderly as they boarded buses that would carry them away from their homes forever. The evacuation itself was a massive logistical operation. More than 1,200 buses were requisitioned from across Ukraine and driven to Pripyat to transport the entire population. Within about 3 hours, nearly 50,000 people were evacuated from the city. They left behind everything: apartments full of furniture, personal belongings, photographs, pets, and entire lifetimes of possessions. The city was frozen in time, a snapshot of Soviet life in the mid-1980s, suddenly abandoned. Meals were left half-eaten on tables, laundry hung on lines, children's toys lay scattered in playgrounds, and the amusement park's Ferris wheel and bumper cars stood ready for the May Day celebration that would never come. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the contamination was far worse than initially admitted. The Soviet government eventually established an exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the Chernobyl plant where human habitation would be permanently prohibited. Pripyat, located just 3 kilometers from the plant, was at the heart of the zone. The city was effectively erased from Soviet maps and became a forbidden place, patrolled by military guards accessible only to authorized personnel involved in cleanup operations and scientific monitoring. The residents of Pripyat were scattered across Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union, their tight-knit community destroyed, and their city left to decay in radioactive silence. In the years that followed, Pripyat became a haunting symbol of the Chernobyl disaster. Nature began to reclaim the abandoned city. Trees grew through pavement, buildings crumbled from neglect, and wild animals moved into the empty streets and buildings. The amusement park, with its iconic yellow Ferris wheel that never carried a single passenger, became one of the most recognizable and poignant images of Chernobyl. The city's swimming pool, cultural center, and schools slowly deteriorated, becoming eerie monuments to lives interrupted and futures canceled. Pripyat stands as a ghost city, a testament to the human cost of nuclear catastrophe and Soviet deception. Today, Pripyat remains largely abandoned, though it has become a destination for dark tourism and scientific research. Visitors can obtain special permits to tour the exclusion zone and walk the empty streets of Pripyat. Though radiation levels remain elevated in many areas and strict safety protocols must be followed, the city serves as a powerful and sobering reminder of what was lost, not just the buildings and infrastructure, but an entire community, their way of life, and the trust that was betrayed when authorities chose secrecy over the safety and well-being of the people they were supposed to protect. Pripyat's abandonment is a physical manifestation of the lies and negligence that define the Chernobyl disaster. One of the most surprising and counterintuitive developments in the decades since the Chernobyl disaster is the unexpected thriving of wildlife within the exclusion zone. When humans evacuated the 30-kilometer zone around a destroyed reactor in 1986, they left behind a radioactive landscape that many scientists believed would become a dead zone where little life could survive. Instead, the opposite has occurred. In the absence of human activity, the exclusion zone has become an accidental wildlife sanctuary where animal populations have flourished in ways that were never anticipated. Shortly after the evacuation, scientists expected that radiation would decimate animal populations through acute radiation sickness, sterility, and genetic mutations. Initial observations seem to confirm these fears. The so-called red forest, a pine forest near the reactor that turned reddish-brown and died from extreme radiation exposure, was a stark reminder of radiation's destructive power. Domestic animals left behind by evacuees, including dogs, cats, and livestock, faced grim fates. However, as the years passed, something unexpected began to happen. Wild animal populations began to rebound, and species that had been rare or absent in the region before the disaster began to reappear. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is home to thriving populations of wolves, deer, boar, elk, and even rare species like lynx and European bison. Camera trap studies have documented a remarkable diversity and abundance of wildlife, with animal populations in the zone now comparable to or even exceeding those in uncontaminated nature reserves. This resurgence has led some scientists to describe Chernobyl as an unintentional rewilding experiment, demonstrating that the removal of human pressure, farming, hunting, urban development, can allow ecosystems to recover even in the presence of significant radioactive contamination. However, the apparent thriving of wildlife in the exclusion zone does not mean that radiation is harmless. Scientific studies have found extensive evidence of radiation's biological effects on animals and plants in the zone. Genetic mutations, including increased rates of chromosomal abnormalities, have been documented in multiple species. Some studies have found higher rates of cataracts, albinism, and developmental abnormalities in animals within the zone compared to those in uncontaminated areas. Birds nesting in highly contaminated areas have been found to have smaller brains and higher rates of tumors and deformities. The paradox is that while radiation does cause biological harm, the harm caused by human activity, habitat destruction, hunting, pollution, appears to have been even more significant for wildlife populations before the disaster. In other words, wildlife is thriving not because radiation is benign, but because the absence of humans has created a de facto nature reserve where animals face fewer threats than they would outside the zone. This does not diminish the dangers of radiation. Rather, it highlights the profound impact that human activity has on natural ecosystems. Some researchers have challenged the optimistic narrative of Chernobyl as a wildlife paradise, arguing that apparent population increases may mask underlying health problems and reduce lifespans in individual animals. Studies of specific species, such as barn swallows and insects, have found evidence of reduced population density, impaired reproduction, and physiological stress in contaminated areas compared to control sites. The debate among scientists continues, with some emphasizing the resilience of ecosystems and others warning that unseen biological damage is accumulating in the genetic material of organisms living in the zone. The wildlife of Chernobyl also serves as a living laboratory for studying the long-term biological effects of radiation exposure. Researchers continue to monitor multiple generations of animals born in the zone, tracking mutations, health outcomes, and evolutionary adaptations. Some studies suggest that certain populations may be developing adaptations to radiation exposure, though this remains a highly controversial and debated topic. What is clear is that the exclusion zone represents a unique ecosystem unlike any other on Earth, a place where nature has reclaimed the landscape even as a legacy of nuclear disaster remains embedded in the soil, water, and every living creature. In the months following the Chernobyl explosion, Soviet authorities face an urgent and unprecedented challenge: how to contain a destroyed nuclear reactor that continued to emit massive amounts of radiation. The solution they devised was the construction of a massive concrete and steel structure to encase the ruins of reactor number 4, known as the object shelter, or more ominously, the sarcophagus. This structure was one of the most dangerous and challenging construction projects ever undertaken, built in record time by workers exposed to lethal doses of radiation. Construction of the sarcophagus began in May 1986, just weeks after the explosion. The design was developed hastily, with engineers working from incomplete information about the condition of the reactor ruins and the structural stability of what remained of the reactor building. The primary goal was speed, to cover the destroyed reactor before winter, whether it could spread more radioactive contamination. Workers, many of them liquidators drafted from across the Soviet Union, labored around the clock in shifts limited to just minutes at a time due to the extreme radiation levels. The construction process was nightmarish. The radioactive ruins of the reactor made it impossible to work on the structure directly, so engineers designed sections that could be assembled nearby and then moved into place using cranes and heavy machinery operated remotely or by workers in brief, dangerous shifts. Concrete was poured and steel beams were erected under conditions that would be unthinkable at any ordinary construction site. Radiation monitors frequently maxed out, and workers often exceeded their lifetime maximum radiation doses within weeks or days of arriving at the site. By November 1986, the sarcophagus was complete, a massive shell of concrete and steel that enclosed the destroyed reactor. The structure was 20 stories tall and required more than 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,000 tons of metal to build. It was hailed as a triumph of Soviet engineering and determination, a symbol that the disaster had been contained and the danger was past. However, the reality was far less reassuring. The sarcophagus had been built so quickly, under such extreme conditions, that it was structurally unsound from the beginning. Within years of its completion, the sarcophagus began to deteriorate. The hastily constructed structure had numerous gaps and cracks that allowed rain, snow, and birds to enter, creating pathways for radioactive dust and contaminated water to escape. The roof, in particular, was a major concern. Sections of it were supported by the damaged remains of the original reactor building, which continued to degrade over time. Engineers estimated that if the roof collapsed, it could disturb the radioactive dust and debris inside the sarcophagus, creating a new release of radiation that, while not as catastrophic as the original explosion, could still spread contamination across a wide area. International efforts to address the sarcophagus's instability began in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Ukraine inherited the Chernobyl site, but lacked the resources to address the problem alone. With funding from international donors, engineers began planning a new safe confinement, a much larger and more sophisticated structure that would be built over the original sarcophagus. This new structure, often called the New Arch, was designed to last 100 years and allow for the eventual dismantling and removal of the radioactive materials inside. The new safe confinement was completed in 2016, 30 years after the disaster. It is one of the largest movable structures ever built, with an arch span of 257 meters and a height of 108 meters. The structure was built on rails adjacent to the old sarcophagus, and then slowly moved into position over the course of several weeks. Its completion was a significant milestone, providing a more secure and stable containment for the destroyed reactor. However, the new safe confinement is not a permanent solution. It is designed to last a century, after which the question of what to do with Chernobyl's radioactive legacy will need to be answered again. The reactor ruins remain a dangerous, unresolved problem that future generations will inherit. While the immediate catastrophe at Chernobyl was confined to the reactor site and the surrounding exclusion zone, the radioactive fallout from the explosion spread across vast distances, contaminating large areas of Europe and exposing millions of people to radiation. In the days following the explosion, winds carried a radioactive plume containing dozens of different isotopes, including iodine, 131, cesium, 137, and strontium, 90, in multiple directions, creating a complex and unpredictable pattern of contamination that extended far beyond Soviet borders. The first international detection of Chernobyl's radioactive cloud came at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden on April 28, 1986. Workers at the plant triggered radiation alarms when arriving for their shifts, and initial investigations feared a leak at Forsmark itself. When Swedish authorities determined that the radiation was coming from outside the plant, they traced the radioactive particles in the atmosphere back to the Soviet Union. Sweden demanded an explanation from Soviet authorities, who were forced to acknowledge that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl. This was the first time the Soviet government publicly admitted the disaster, more than 2 days after the explosion. As more data became available, the scale of the contamination became clear. The radioactive plume moved in multiple directions, depending on wind patterns in the days after the explosion. Significant contamination occurred in Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia closest to the plant, but the plume also traveled northwest into Scandinavia, west into Poland and Germany, and south into the Balkans and parts of Turkey. Britain, France, and Italy also detected elevated radiation levels, though generally at lower concentrations than areas closer to the disaster site. The most dangerous isotope in the immediate aftermath was iodine, 131, which has a half-life of about 8 days and concentrates in the thyroid gland. Contamination of grass and forage crops led to iodine, 131 entering the food chain through milk, particularly in areas where cows graze on contaminated pastures. Children who drank contaminated milk in the weeks following the disaster were at especially high risk, and thousands of cases of thyroid cancer have been directly attributed to this exposure. In many affected areas, the danger from iodine, 131, was not communicated to the public until it was too late to take protective measures like distributing potassium iodide tablets or banning the sale of contaminated milk. Longer-lived isotopes like cesium, 137, with a half-life of about 30 years, created persistent contamination that remains a concern decades later. Cesium, 137 binds to soil particles and concentrates in plants, entering the food chain and accumulating in the tissues of animals and humans. In some areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Scandinavia, cesium, 137 contamination remains above safe levels, and agricultural restrictions on certain crops and wild harvested foods like mushrooms and berries are still in place. Hunters in Germany, Austria, and parts of Scandinavia still test wild boar and game animals for cesium, 137 contamination, before consumption. The health consequences of this widespread contamination have been hotly debated. While the dramatic increase in thyroid cancer among those exposed as children is well documented and accepted, the long-term cancer risk from lower-level exposures across Europe is more difficult to quantify. Some studies suggest that thousands of additional cancer cases may be attributable to Chernobyl radiation, while others argue that the doses received by most European populations were too low to produce measurable increases in cancer rates. The debate continues, with different scientific organizations and governmental bodies producing widely varying risk estimates. What is undeniable is that the Chernobyl disaster demonstrated that nuclear accidents do not respect borders. The radioactive contamination spread across dozens of countries, affecting millions of people who live hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the disaster site. The Soviet Union's initial secrecy and refusal to share information compounded the harm, denying people in the path of the radioactive plume the opportunity to take protective actions. Chernobyl's fallout is a stark reminder that the consequences of nuclear disasters are truly global, creating international health and environmental impacts that can last for generations. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet medical system was faced with an unprecedented public health crisis involving mass radiation exposure. However, instead of prioritizing transparent treatment and long-term monitoring of affected populations, Soviet authorities implemented a systematic campaign to suppress medical data, control information, and in some cases use radiation victims as subject for scientific study without informed consent. This medical cover-up, which continued even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has had lasting consequences for survivors and has hindered international understanding of radiation's long-term health effects. One of the first acts of medical suppression was the directive issued to doctors treating radiation casualties to avoid listing radiation as a cause of illness or death on medical records. Physicians were instructed to attribute deaths to secondary conditions, pneumonia, heart failure, organ failure, that were caused by radiation exposure, but did not explicitly name radiation as the underlying cause. This falsification of medical records served multiple purposes. It allowed Soviet authorities to maintain the fiction that only a small number of people had died from Chernobyl. It prevented radiation victims and their families from claiming compensation, and it protected the Soviet nuclear program from liability and criticism. Medical professionals who attempted to document the true health effects of radiation exposure face intimidation, censorship, and professional retaliation. Doctors who treated liquidators and evacuees were often required to sign non-disclosure agreements, forbidden from discussing their patients' conditions or sharing medical data with international researchers. Some physicians who spoke publicly about the health crisis they were witnessing were demoted, dismissed from their positions, or subjected to harassment by security services. This climate of fear ensured that much of the medical reality of Chernobyl remained hidden from public view. At Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, where the most severely irradiated victims were taken, American physician Dr. Robert Gale was invited by Soviet authorities to assist with bone marrow transplants for acute radiation syndrome patients. While Gale's humanitarian efforts were genuine, his presence also served Soviet propaganda purposes, allowing authorities to claim they were pursuing cutting-edge treatment and international cooperation. However, Gale and other Western medical personnel were given limited access to patient information and were closely supervised by Soviet officials. The true extent of radiation injuries and the outcomes of many patients remain unclear, with much medical data from Hospital No. 6 still classified or lost. In the years following the disaster, there is evidence that some radiation-exposed populations were subjected to research studies without proper informed consent. Liquidators, evacuees, and residents of contaminated areas were monitored and tested by Soviet medical researchers, but often without being told the purpose of the studies or the risks associated with their exposures. This research generated valuable scientific data on radiation's effects, but it violated basic medical ethics principles that were already well established internationally. Some survivors and advocacy groups have described feeling like they were treated as experimental subjects rather than patients deserving of care and respect. The suppression of medical data has had lasting consequences for understanding Chernobyl's health impacts. Incomplete and unreliable health registries make it extremely difficult to conduct rigorous epidemiological studies of cancer rates, cardiovascular disease, and other long-term health outcomes in exposed populations. Soviet authorities failed to establish comprehensive baseline health data before the disaster, and follow-up monitoring was inconsistent and politically influenced. As a result, scientific debates about Chernobyl's true health toll continued decades later, with widely divergent estimates that reflect, in part, the poor quality of available medical data. International health organizations have been criticized for accepting Soviet-era data and definitions at face value. Reports by the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency on Chernobyl's health effects have been accused of downplaying the disaster's impact and relying too heavily on official statistics that were known to be incomplete or falsified. Independent researchers and health advocates argue that these international bodies have prioritized political considerations and the interests of the nuclear industry over scientific rigor and the well-being of radiation victims. The medical suppression and manipulation that began with the Soviet cover-up has, in many ways, been perpetuated by institutional reluctance to confront the full truth about Chernobyl's devastating health legacy. The Chernobyl disaster was not an isolated accident caused by a single night of operator errors. It was the inevitable result of a deeply flawed safety culture that permeated the entire Soviet nuclear industry. This culture prioritized reduction quotas, political loyalty, and secrecy over safety, creating conditions where catastrophic failures were not just possible but predictable. Understanding the safety culture is essential to understanding why Chernobyl happened and why similar disasters could occur again anywhere that similar attitudes toward nuclear safety prevail. Soviet nuclear facilities operated under a system where meeting production targets was paramount. Nuclear power plants were expected to generate electricity according to 5-year plans established by Communist Party officials, and plant managers faced severe consequences for failing to meet these quotas. This created enormous pressure to keep reactors operating even when safety concerns arose. Shutting down a reactor for maintenance or safety modifications meant missing production targets, which could result in punishment for plant management. As a result, known safety issues were often ignored or deferred, and reactors continued operating under conditions that would have been deemed unacceptable in Western nuclear facilities. The hierarchical and authoritarian nature of Soviet society also contributed to a dangerous dynamic at nuclear plants. Senior engineers and managers like Anatoly Dyatlov at Chernobyl wielded enormous authority and were often not questioned by subordinate operators, even when they issued orders that violated safety protocols. On the night of the disaster, there are accounts of operators expressing concerns about the reactor's behavior and the safety of the tests being conducted, but these concerns were dismissed or overridden by Dyatlov and other senior staff. This culture of obedience and fear of challenging authority figures meant that dangerous decisions went unchallenged. Secrecy was another critical component of the flawed safety culture. Information about reactor design flaws, previous accidents at nuclear facilities, and safety concerns was routinely classified as state secrets. Operators at one nuclear plant were often unaware of problems that had occurred at other facilities, preventing them from learning from past mistakes. Even technical manuals and operating procedures sometimes omitted crucial information about reactor behavior and limitations because acknowledging these issues would have been politically embarrassing. Operators at Chernobyl, for example, were not fully informed about the positive void coefficient and the behavior control rods during emergency shutdown, knowledge that might have prevented the disaster. Training and expertise of nuclear plant operators was also inconsistent. While some Soviet nuclear engineers were highly skilled and knowledgeable, the rapid expansion of the nuclear program meant that many plants were staffed by operators with insufficient training and experience. Political connections and Communist Party membership were sometimes valued more highly than technical competence in personnel decisions. This meant that nuclear reactors, some of the most complex and dangerous technologies ever created, were sometimes operated by individuals who did not fully understand the systems they were controlling. The Soviet system also lacked independent oversight and regulatory enforcement. In Western countries, nuclear facilities are subject to inspection and regulation by independent agencies that have the authority to shut down plants or require safety modifications. In the Soviet Union, the same government bureaucracy that was responsible for expanding nuclear power and meeting production quotas was also nominally responsible for safety oversight, creating an inherent conflict of interest. Regulators who were too aggressive in enforcing safety standards could be accused of obstructing state priorities and face career consequences. This weak regulatory environment meant that safety violations often went uncorrected until they resulted in disaster. Even after the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet nuclear safety culture was slow to change. Other RBMK reactors continued operating for years, and even decades after the disaster, with only partial modifications to address the design flaws that had caused the explosion. Some RBMK reactors remain in operation well into the 21st century. The institutional resistance to acknowledging fundamental problems and implementing comprehensive reforms reflects how deeply embedded the flawed safety culture was. Chernobyl should have been a wake-up call, but the changes that followed were often superficial, driven more by international pressure and public fear than by genuine transformation of safety priorities within the Soviet nuclear establishment. The environmental legacy of Chernobyl is not a closed chapter in history. It is an ongoing catastrophe written into the soil, the water, and the very structure of life in a region. Long after fires went out and the headlines faded, the elements released on the night of April 26, 1986, had continued to move, to decay, and to poison. The truth is that what exploded at Chernobyl was not just a reactor, but the future of an entire landscape. The contamination is not something that can be cleaned up in a human lifetime. In many respects, It will outlast every person alive today. This is a part of the story that has been consistently softened, minimized, or buried. The fact that Chernobyl did not end. It simply slowed down to a pace too slow for the news cycle, but far too fast for the natural world to absorb safely. When reactor number 4 exploded, it ejected a toxic cocktail of radionuclides into the atmosphere. Iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium isotopes, and many others. Each of these elements behaves differently in the environment, and each has its own half-life. The time it takes for half of the radioactive atoms to decay. Iodine-131 decays relatively quickly, with a half-life of about 8 days, but in those first weeks it caused immense damage, especially to children's thyroid glands. Cesium-137 and strontium-90, on the other hand, have half-lives of around 30 years. That means that even today, decades later, only about half of what fell in the fields, forests, and rivers is decayed. The rest is still there, cycling through ecosystems, entering food chains, and quietly delivering low, chronic doses of radiation, plutonium isotopes, with half-lives measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years, ensure that parts of the exclusion zone will remain hazardous on timescales that make human politics and borders look irrelevant. The term exclusion zone itself often creates an illusion of containment, as if the contamination were neatly fenced off within a 30-kilometer circle. In reality, the radioactive fallout did not respect that boundary. It fell unevenly, in hot spots determined by wind, rain, and local geography. Some areas far beyond the official zone received significant contamination, while certain pockets inside the zone are relatively less affected. In contaminated forests, radionuclides bind to organic matter in soil, get taken up by plants, eaten by herbivores, and then by predators, circulating in an invisible loop of exposure. Mushrooms and berries, beloved staples in Eastern European diets, are especially notorious for concentrating cesium-137. In some rural communities, people still rely on these foods out of necessity or habit, unknowingly ingesting the radioactive legacy of 1986. Water systems have their own long memory. Radioactive particles from Chernobyl settled onto the surface of rivers and lakes, or washed into them from contaminated soil. The Pripyat River carried them into the Dnieper, a major waterway that supplies drinking water to millions. Sediments on river and lake bottoms act as reservoirs for long-lived radionuclides. On calm days, they seem safely buried, but floods, erosion, or human activity can stir them up again, re-releasing contamination into the water column. This means that even where surface water seems clean by conventional measurements, the potential for recontamination remains, hidden beneath the mud and silt. The idea that contamination is purely a past event ignores this dynamic cycle. Radioactive material does not simply sit still. It moves with every current, every storm, every disturbance. Forests around Chernobyl tell another, darker side of the story. The Red Forest, named for the reddish hue the pine trees turned before dying from massive radiation doses, was one of the most contaminated areas in the world. Many of those trees were bulldozed and buried, but the soil beneath remains heavily radioactive. New vegetation grows, takes up cesium and strontium from the ground, and becomes a new reservoir of contamination. This creates a terrifying feedback loop when wildfires occur. When contaminated forests burn, radionuclides locked in wood and leaf litter are released again into the smoke, carried by the wind over long distances. Every major wildfire in the exclusion zone is, in a sense, a miniature rerun of Chernobyl's fallout, smaller in scale, but still capable of spreading radioactive particles into inhabited areas. Perhaps the most haunting symbol of Chernobyl's enduring contamination is the so-called elephant's foot, a mass of solidified corium, molten fuel, concrete, sand, and metal that formed beneath Reactor 4. In the weeks after the disaster, when the molten core burned its way through the reactor's lower structures, it cooled and solidified into grotesque, lava-like forms. The most famous of these resembles the wrinkled, cracked skin of an elephant's leg, hence the name. In the late 1980s, simply standing near the elephant's foot for a few minutes would have delivered a fatal dose of radiation. Over time, its radioactivity has decreased, but it remains one of the most dangerous pieces of material on Earth. It is also a reminder that the horror of Chernobyl catastrophe is not resolved by concrete and steel. The source of contamination is still there, entombed but not neutralized, quietly emitting radiation every second of every day. When people say that Chernobyl is safe enough now for brief visits or tourism, there's a grain of truth in that, but also a dangerous oversimplification. Radiation exposure is about dose and time. A tourist spending a few hours on control paths will receive a relatively small dose, probably less than a long airplane flight. But that same landscape, harmless for a day's visit, becomes a very different story when you imagine living, eating, drinking, and raising children there. That is what was taken from the people of Pripyat and hundreds of villages around Chernobyl. Not just their homes, but the possibility of ever safely returning to the land that shaped their identities. The contamination is not dramatic or cinematic. It is slow, invisible, and enduring. In that sense, it is a perfect metaphor for the deeper truth of Chernobyl. The damage is not only in the past. It is written into the future in half-lives and decayed chains, in forests that burn radioactive, in rivers that carry a history they never chose. Chernobyl did not only contaminate land and bodies. It contaminated politics, trust, and the global conversation about nuclear power. The explosion of reactor 4 was a moment when a closed, authoritarian system collided with an invisible force it could not fully control or hide. For decades, the Soviet Union had projected an image of technological mastery and inevitable progress, and its nuclear program was a cornerstone of that narrative. When Chernobyl happened, it tore a hole in that illusion. The true story of how the disaster reshaped global politics and nuclear policy is one of embarrassed governments, silenced experts, and societies forced to confront the cost of secrets. Inside the Soviet Union, Chernobyl became a catalyst for something that had been unthinkable for most of its history: public criticism of the state. Mikhail Gorbachev had already begun a cautious policy of glasnost, openness, before 1986, but the disaster exposed how deeply rooted secrecy and denial still were. The initial attempt to hide the scale of the accident, the delayed evacuation of Pripyat, and the bland, misleading statements in Soviet media outraged many citizens once the truth started leaking out. Scientists, doctors, and local officials began to speak more openly about the lies and the negligence they had witnessed. Chernobyl didn't create glasnost, but accelerated it, forcing the Soviet leadership to allow more transparency simply because the world already knew something catastrophic had happened. Internationally, Chernobyl shattered the idea that nuclear accidents could be contained within national borders. Western governments watched as radiation clouds drifted over Europe, triggering alarms in countries that had no say in how Soviet reactors were designed or operated. In many places, public trust in both domestic and foreign nuclear authorities eroded. People saw their governments issuing conflicting statements about food safety, rainfall, and contamination, and they remembered how long it took the Soviet Union to even admit the accident had occurred. Nuclear energy, once sold as a symbol of clean, modern progress, suddenly looked like a technology that could turn entire regions into permanent sacrifice zones if something went wrong. The political impact in Europe was especially profound. Anti-nuclear movements that had existed on the margins gained new strength and legitimacy. Protesters could now point at Chernobyl as a real, not hypothetical, example of what happens when nuclear risk is mismanaged or minimized. In countries like Germany, public pressure mounted against existing nuclear plants and future projects. Over the following decades, elections, coalition governments, and policy debates were shaped in part by the memory of Chernobyl and the fear that something similar could happen closer to home. In some states, nuclear expansion plans were shelved or significantly delayed. In others, long-term phase-out policies were eventually adopted, even if they took years to implement. Chernobyl also forced international institutions to rethink how nuclear safety was governed. Agreements were created or strengthened to require earlier notification of cross-border nuclear accidents and more sharing of information about plant design and incidents. Safety standards were revised, stress tests became more rigorous, and reactor operators were pressured to be more transparent. But these reforms came with an uncomfortable caveat. They depended on governments being honest. The very existence of new protocols was an admission that secrecy had been deadly at Chernobyl, yet there was no guarantee that future governments would behave differently under pressure. Within the Soviet bloc and its successor states, Chernobyl contributed to a broader erosion of faith in the system. It was not just an industrial accident. It was proof that the state could and would lie about matters of life and death. People saw friends and relatives relocated, sickened, or quietly buried, while official statistics insisted that only a few dozen had died. This gap between lived reality and official narrative deepened cynicism. Chernobyl joined Afghanistan, economic stagnation, and nationalist tensions as one more weight pulling the Soviet Union toward collapse. When the USSR finally dissolved in 1991, the ruins of Reactor 4 stood as a physical monument to a regime that promised modernity and delivered catastrophe. Globally, the narrative of nuclear power changed from pure optimism to uneasy compromise. Some countries doubled down, arguing that Chernobyl was a uniquely Soviet failure tied to a flawed reactor design and a dysfunctional political system. Others took the opposite lesson, that any complex system run by fallible humans, under political and economic pressure, is vulnerable to the same chain of denial, shortcuts, and mistakes. Every debate about nuclear energy since 1986 has unfolded in the shadow of Chernobyl. When reactors are proposed or extended, communities ask not just about kilowatts and carbon emissions, but about evacuation plans, emergency communication, and whether they can really trust the people in charge to tell the truth when something goes wrong. Perhaps the most lasting political legacy of Chernobyl is the way it exposed the cost of withholding truth. For a few crucial days, Soviet authorities tried to protect their image instead of their people. That decision turned a terrible accident into a defining symbol of state deception. The world learned that radiation does not need a visa to cross borders, and that lies can be as dangerous as any plume of fallout. The real deception was not just in the design of the RBMK or the falsified death tolls. It was in the promise that such a system could ever be made perfectly safe in the hands of institutions that fear transparency more than disaster. Most people think they know what happened at Chernobyl: a reckless nighttime test, a burst of radiation, a doomed Soviet town, and a handful of tragic deaths. That version is simple, cinematic, and convenient. It lets governments, agencies, and even the nuclear industry say, it was human error, it was Soviet incompetence, it was a unique anomaly. But when the myths are stripped away, a very different picture emerges. The truth is not that Chernobyl was an unimaginable freak event. The truth is that it was imaginable, predicted, and in many ways, inevitable in the system that created it. One of the most persistent myths is that Chernobyl was just the result of a few operators breaking rules during a test. That story puts the blame neatly at the control panel level and absolves the reactor design, the bureaucracy, and the political culture that made the disaster possible. In reality, the RBMK reactor had lethal design flaws baked into its core, a positive void coefficient that made the reactor more reactive as it lost coolant, and graphite-tipped control rods that caused a spike in power the moment an emergency shutdown was initiated. The operators on duty made mistakes, yes, but they were operating a machine that could turn those mistakes into an explosion in seconds. To say Chernobyl was only human error is like saying a plane crash was caused only by the pilot, when the wings were designed to fall off in turbulence. Another widely repeated myth is the official death toll, 31 victims. That number appears in reports, press conferences, and official statistics, and it sounds almost reassuring. It suggests that the disaster was horrifying but contained, that its human cost was tragic but limited. The reality is that 31 is the number of people who died in the immediate aftermath from acute radiation syndrome and related injuries, mostly firefighters and plant workers. It does not count the liquidators sent to shovel radioactive debris off the roof, the miners who dug tunnels under the reactor, the children who later developed thyroid cancer, or the countless people who suffered cancers, heart disease, and other illnesses in the years and decades that followed. The debate over the exact number will continue, but what is beyond doubt is that 31 is not a serious estimate of the true human toll. It is a politically convenient fiction. There's also the myth of the mutant zone, the idea that Chernobyl created a landscape populated by monstrous animals and grotesquely deformed humans. This image is powerful and frightening, and has been amplified by sensational media and popular culture, but it is also misleading. The exclusion zone is not a sci-fi wasteland full of three-headed deer and glowing wolves. Instead, It is something more subtle and in many ways more unsettling, a seemingly normal landscape where radiation quietly alters DNA, shortens lives, and increases the risk of disease. Many animals appear healthy. Populations have rebounded in the absence of humans, and to a casual visitor the forest looks alive and lush. The horror is not an obvious monstrosity, but an invisible damage that does not make for dramatic images. On the other end of the spectrum lies another comforting myth, that Chernobyl is over, a historical event safely sealed in concrete and archived in memory. The construction of the original sarcophagus and later the new safe confinement gave the impression that the problem had been solved, boxed up, and put away. But the corium, the molten fuel and structural materials beneath the reactor, still exists. The radionuclides released into the environment are still decaying on timescales measured in decades, centuries, and millennia. Forests still burn and re-release contamination. People in affected regions still undergo health screenings, still debate whether their cancers, miscarriages, or heart problems are linked to 1986. The idea that Chernobyl is behind us is another way of refusing to confront a disaster that is simply unfolding slower than the human attention span. Perhaps the most insidious myth of all is that Chernobyl taught the world its lesson and that it can never happen again. After every major accident, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, the narrative quickly shifts toward reassurance, new regulations, improved designs, better training. Some of these changes are real and meaningful, but they do not erase the deeper pattern. Complex technologies run by institutions that face political and economic pressure to cut corners, downplay risks, and protect their image. The core deception is not a single lie about a number or a timeline. It is a promise that any system run by fallible humans can ever be made completely safe, especially when those humans are rewarded for good news and punished for bad. The real story of Chernobyl is not a story of a single night gone wrong. It is a story of reactor design with known flaws, operated in a culture where subordinates were afraid to challenge their superiors, overseen by a state that classified safety concerns as secrets, and remembered by a world that prefers simple narratives to uncomfortable truths. We were deceived not only by Soviet censors, but by our own willingness to accept easy explanations. The myths make Chernobyl feel like an aberration. The reality warns that, under the wrong conditions, it was a preview. Chernobyl's legacy is not confined to the ruins of Reactor 4 or the ghost city of Pripyat. Its real legacy lives in questions that still haunt governments, scientists, and ordinary people around the world. How much risk are we willing to accept for the sake of progress? Who gets to decide what level of danger is acceptable? And what happens when those in charge decide that the truth itself is too dangerous to share? The story of Chernobyl forces these questions into the open because it shows what happens when they are answered in secret, behind closed doors. For the people most directly affected, that legacy began with loss. The residents of Pripyat and hundreds of villages were told they would be evacuated for a few days. They never returned. Their homes, possessions, and entire communities were left behind to rot in the shadow of the plant. Liquidators, soldiers, firefighters, engineers, miners were praised as heroes while being kept in the dark about the full extent of their exposure. Many of them lived the rest of their short lives fighting illnesses that no official wanted to link directly to Chernobyl. Their families often had to fight not just disease, but bureaucracy and denial. The gap between private suffering and public acknowledgement is one of the deepest scars left by the disaster. Beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union, Chernobyl changed how entire societies thought about technology and trust. It demonstrated that a government could lie, not just about politics or economics, but about radiation levels in the air and the food people were feeding their children. It showed that international organizations could be slow to challenge those lies, worried about diplomatic fallout or the reputational damage to an entire industry. When people later heard reassurances about other reactors, other accidents, or other complex systems, chemical plants, deep water drilling, genetic engineering, they remembered Chernobyl. Even if they could not quote the technical details, they understood the pattern. Everything is under control is sometimes the most dangerous sentence of all. At the same time, the world did not abandon nuclear power. In some countries, reactors were shut down or phased out. In others, new ones were built. Climate change added a new layer to the debate. with some arguing that nuclear energy is necessary to reduce carbon emissions. The ghost of Chernobyl now sits at the table in every serious discussion about energy policy. It is invoked by critics as proof that the technology is too dangerous, and by proponents as a warning of what happens when reactors are built and operated without transparency and robust safety culture. The true legacy of Chernobyl is not a clear verdict for or against nuclear power. It is a permanent reminder that any technology capable of great power is also capable of great harm when truth is treated as optional. There is another, quieter legacy, the moral responsibility to remember. Chernobyl is often reduced to images: the Ferris wheel in Pripyat, the cracked concrete of the sarcophagus, the haunting photographs of abandoned classrooms. But behind those images are individual lives that were interrupted, shortened, or reshaped. Children who grew up sick, workers who watched their comrades die in hospital wards, farmers who saw their land declared unfit for use for generations. Remembering them requires more than sharing aesthetic pictures of urban decay. It requires telling the story as it was. A disaster made worse by secrecy, denial, and the decision to protect institutions before people. In the end, Chernobyl's true legacy is a warning written in radiation and concrete. When a system is built on belief that admitting weakness is more dangerous than ignoring it, catastrophe is only a matter of time. The lies may differ. The technology may change. The flags may be different colors. But the pattern is the same. That is why the story still matters. It is not just about one reactor in 1986. It is about every place where those in power are tempted to say, "There's nothing to worry about," when they know they cannot guarantee it. And if you believe that stories like this need to be told honestly, without the comforting myths, without the convenient numbers, then this is just the beginning. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who still thinks Chernobyl was just an accident. The more people see what was really buried, the harder it becomes for anyone, anywhere, to hide the truth the next time something goes wrong.